Okay, and we can get started with introductions. I see a few new faces. James, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is James Ma. I'm a new face to the most, maybe not the others. I am currently a product manager at Google. I work on the serverless team, and so thought a good idea to start showing up to some of these meetings. We use build packs in a few ways to support some of our SaaS products. And so I work on a team that's relatively newly formed, that's using build packs in some unique ways. So it's a bit early for us out here in the West Coast, but I think over the next few weeks, we're going to try to attend a few more of these working sessions.
Nice, welcome. Okay, and next up we have release planning.
I can speak a little bit for the implementation team. We're planning to cut a patch of the life cycle to fix some auth-related bugs. I imagine we're going to cut a release candidate today and then ship probably next week.
There's a small refactoring request. Is it possible to get that in the patch, or is that too late? Yeah.
I'll take a look.
Thank you. Javier, any back or platform updates?
If I'm not mistaken, we are waiting on that patch from the lifecycle in order for us to make some of the changes we're waiting for to release.
Cool. On the back team side, we switched over our main branch to V2, and we created a new branch for the V1 API, so that if we wanted to, we could still cut releases off of that, but all of the new development will now happen on the V2 branch. We haven't cut a release yet, but we just wanted to switch the dev branch to V2. The .profile build pack RFC was also merged, and there's a new repository for that. So I think we'll start working on that, and we're hoping to use the libcnb v2 for writing out the .profile build pack. That's pretty much it. And I think we also have an announcement. Aiden was newly elected the learning maintainer as of last night. So welcome, Aiden. Any learning team updates?
We've got a meeting tomorrow, and what we're going to focus on, because the technical oversight committee's asked us to, is basically the onboarding docs. We want to be able to get application developers onto build packs with a little bit more ease. And once we got that done, we'll go on to some more deeper dive stuff, but no announcements or releases yet.
I think we also had a really nice KubeCon, so we'll try to do a recap in one of the future meetings about the feedback we got from users and that attended the project meeting and also the booth. So yeah. And I think we don't have anyone from distribution, so we can move on to the agenda items. First one, it's the PID1 launcher stuff. Ben, are you taking that?
I can. I'm just not completely caught up on what you wanted to discuss in that meeting particularly, so it might be better if you do it.
Okay. So I think we put in an issue in the RFC repository around the way that the launcher currently handles the fact that it's PID1, or like the applications that are running through build packs are PID1, and how that affects applications running in production, especially when it comes to like reaping zombie processes or handling signals to child processes. So think in the past meetings, we've discussed that this could be like a multi-step approach. The first one was to sort of refactor the launcher code so that it's easier for us in our internal fork of the launcher to sort of introduce the changes to reap child processes and also implement signal handling. But I think in the longer term, we wanted the lifecycle to be able to do something like this based on a config flag in the builder or the run image. Think, if I remember correctly, folks were mostly convinced in the last time we discussed this, and they were fine with a default off value for handling this. And if operators wanted to, they could set this flag to true in their build or like run image, sorry. And then the launcher would actually take care of reaping child processes and also forwarding signals to them. So I think that was the summary from last meetings, but I don't know if folks have any thoughts on it. What are the next steps? Should we start with an RFC? And I think since we also have sort of a version of this working internally, we can also post the actual snippet that's required to have something like this supported in the lifecycle. I think it's very few lines of code. But I think does an RFC with this code sample and the configuration sound good?
That sounds good to me.
Okay, so I think that's just next steps for us. I think someone from our side will start on that RFC then. What's next? The next one is the cosine RFC. Javier, do you have, like, I think it was mostly just the two of us that wanted to talk about this. I just want to figure out like what are the next steps, and I think you also wanted to figure out what should be the order of steps in terms of merging this RFC versus the component level contribution guidelines that we've been talking about.
Yeah, I know there's various ways we can go about it. We can wait until the RFC for the sort of component level contributions gets approved and goes into effect. We could more or less approve the RFC for the idea right now, the cosigner, but note that we don't necessarily or wouldn't answer the question of where it lives. So it might still get blocked by the component level contribution thing, or we could make the decision now for the cosigner RFC to be approved and designated to the platform team, and then do whatever we can within the current confines of our sort of permissions and governance structure, and then expand upon that later once we go through some more of the component level stuff. I think to move it forward, option 3 sounds best or easiest to me. I don't know how you feel about it, Sam.
think I am generally fine with the platform team owning this. I think it's really up to the platform maintainers to see if they'd be fine with it.
Yeah, I think the only thing that I know we've agreed on, and I would sort of put as the caveat here, is just sort of denoting within the README that it's A, experimental, and B, if you need any sort of or have any questions, comments, concerns, go ping Sam, right?
Does it have to be go ping Sam? Can we just go with this is experimental and like use at your own risk, sort of? I mean,
Yeah,
every open
I'm
source
comfortable with
project
that.
comes
Yeah.
with use at your own risk, but we can make that explicit that it's still experimental and use at your own risk.
Right. Yeah, I'd be comfortable with that. I think the concern is just maybe even just optics, right? Of some expecting either David or myself to be sort of maintaining this repository when in fact that might not be the case.
Yeah.
But I am okay with, sort of taking that if necessary.
So I think the only thing left is for me to address any comments about the actual contents of the RFC, but once those are done, we should be able to call for a vote on the platform side.
Yes, yeah. And I believe, I guess that would be under my purview. So I would start the voting process and get everybody to cast their vote if they want an opinion. Cool.
Cool. And I think the last one is Dockerfile plus stack removal strategy. Ali.
Yeah, this is sort of a large topic, and I'm not sure at which angle we should approach it. But just to, I guess, provide some context, right? We have these two features that have sort of been progressing toward implementation. There's support for Docker files, as well as the removal of the stack concept, stack and mixins, in favor of more standardized ways to declare, properties of your base images. And there's also this sort of vague sense that these two features intersect, but we're not sure exactly how. And Docker files is really getting most of the mind share at the moment. Separately, as part of the stack removal, we're also putting certain requirements of base images into the distribution spec. They used to be in the platform spec. We're moving them over into this other spec that's supposed to be somewhat disjoint. And there have been some concerns about that, and kind of wanting to talk things through to make sure that we've uncovered all of the edge cases that will need to be accounted for. And that's kind of been the case for a while. We've just sort of said, we need to talk about stack removal, and then we never do. I think usually we say, we will talk about it when Docker files forces our hand, right? Like when we come to the point where we'd like to ship this thing, and now we realize that we've got to think about stack removal. But that seems somewhat unsatisfactory. So I just put it on the agenda to see if maybe we could get some more concrete, like, next steps or points of discussion. But unfortunately, I don't actually have anything to offer there beyond what I've just said. So anyone have thoughts in this area?
So the current feature, I guess just for context, the feature that you're releasing with, sort of this experimental set of APIs, I believe, does that sort of mandate that we answer the question about stacks? Do they interface with the concept of stacks or targets?
The first phase of Docker files, which I expect will ship, I hope will ship pretty soon because it's almost done, will be the ability to use Docker files to switch your runtime base image. And, in theory, so just to take a step back, right now, when we're doing validations around the stack and validations around, the mix-ins requested by build packs are satisfied by the stack, all of that stuff happens at the platform level. The spec says that the lifecycle does it, but it doesn't do it. And so in theory, right, if your platform has opted into this experimental feature and your runtime base image changes after, you run detect and build packs, sorry, the extensions generate the Docker files, and then you get a new runtime base image. Like, my opinion is it's sort of up to the platform, right? The platform opted into this experimental feature. The platform currently has the onus to validate the mix-ins. So the platform, can just do another validation before running, build or export or whatever, if they want to use this feature, right? I think in the future, we'll push more of that responsibility into the lifecycle and the platform can do less, but I don't know. I don't see a strong need to add additional stuff right now in the lifecycle. But, obviously I'm not a platform operator, so my thinking could be different than what others might.
Yeah, I guess maybe I don't know exactly how the platform works with Docker files as to whether or not it would even have access to the information of the run image that was selected during the process to know what it is doing. It will, okay. Yeah. So I think, I don't know if we want to hammer out like, hey, are we spec compliant? Because it sounds like we're technically not, and we won't be. So I think we probably need to hash that out at some point, right? Either update the spec to say that the lifecycle won't be doing the validation and it's the platform's responsibility, or the inverse, right? But at some point, I do think we should align there. I don't know that part is important at this point in time, right? But I think the same question that the lifecycle has as to whether or not they want to do validation regarding stacks or regarding targets, which I guess we haven't even really discussed on how exactly that goes about. That does seem like a missing feature or a very nice additive, clean feature, right? And so we could sort of draw the line on the sand right now and say, hey, do we want to kind of start making this shift to stack removals as part of the Docker file implementation, or do we want to assume that stack removals is never coming, implement it with stacks, and then do the follow-up after, hypothetically Docker files is complete, and then do the stack removal? I think those are the only real two options I could think of at this point in time. But I do think it's worth making that sort of decision at this junction.
So I had to deal with some of this mix-in validation logic with KPAC a couple of months ago, and currently happens when you create the builder. So it doesn't even happen when you do the build, but it happens when you create the builder. And I guess if it needs to happen during the overall lifecycle build process, I'm guessing it has to happen somewhere between analyze and export, right? And the only ideal places I can think of are like either analyze or just right before export. But
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and at that point, like if the lifecycle is not doing it and the the platform has to inject something in the middle of these phases to validate mixins. I don't think that's something we've ever asked platforms to do, like consume intermediate metadata from the lifecycle.
Yeah, I mean, I think it sounds, if we want to tackle the first question, right, of who should actually be doing this, I may be biased here, right, for not trying to do additional work, but it does seem like if it's something that's, unified across multiple platforms, then it should be something that's built into the lifecycle so that not every platform has to re-implement the same logic.
I think part of the reason platforms started doing it on their own was they started checking it during builder creation time, where the lifecycle doesn't even come into play. I think if you wanted to move it to build time, where you're checking it for each image build operation, then the lifecycle could potentially validate it. But right now we just validate it during builder creation for the platforms that do validate it, which is just Pack and KBack right now. I don't know how other platforms deal with it, which don't use the builder concept. And for all of them, the lifecycle doesn't even come into play.
I mean, in theory, you can still do the validation pre-build because you know which run images you're going to provide as possible run images, right?
Do we?
But
I guess that's the part I'm not sure of. Again, I don't know how the feature works.
I think in this case, we will have to know which run images because they would still need to have all the extra additional metadata. So we can't just pull an arbitrary run image based on user input and inject it. We would still need to create run images with CNB user ID, labels, environment variables, whatever. Whatever the run image requirements are, I think.
I guess, but is it a decision that when the Docker file is being generated by whoever generates the Docker file, is it something where they could select from a list of unknown sources where they know that run image has the information already available?
Could they select from a list of unknown sources where they know? Potentially. Like, I guess you can have an extension that looks at a user provided file where the user provides the run image, and that's a valid run image that the builder never knew of. Like that's potentially possible, where the user provides the run image and the operator never knew about it.
Yeah, that's ultimately my concern, right? Is with the introduction of more or less picking or allowing things to be dynamic, right? I call it sort of dynamic image selection. Then we, like the platform, doesn't know about a lot of stuff.
I kind of want to just focus because I know that like a bunch of things are possible, but it would be nice to focus on like what are the most likely use cases for early adopters of this feature. Like we're just kind of trying to triage our time and energy here, right? Because also the reality is, no one's really stepped forward to kind of own this stack removal stuff. And so it's sort of the case that if we make it a blocker for Docker files, like we're just not going to ship Docker files for, X amount of time, more. And we've already kind of been waiting a while. So my preference very selfishly is that I would love to ship something that's very much like, this is you as the user are taking it upon yourself to ensure that you're providing the appropriate inputs when you're using this feature, right? And that is possible, right? So, that to me seems acceptable, but again, I'm not a platform operator, so.
So I guess the problem is, who are you referring to as the user right now, right? Is it the end user? Is it the platform?
Well, the platform doesn't have to provide an extension that allows app developers to, contribute arbitrary run images, right? That's up to the platform's discretion, and so if you as a platform are not comfortable with the possibility that your run image won't have all the required mix-ins, then, don't enable that extension.
Again, maybe I don't know enough about this, but are the extensions really managed by platforms?
By the builder, yes.
By
Like
the
whoever
builder,
created
not
whoever created the builder manages the
right.
extension.
That's what I'm getting at, right? It's the builder, not the platform. Right. So if in a lot of platforms that we have, the users, the end users, are able to provide a builder.
But as a platform, you also don't need to enable Docker files, right?
But then that builder doesn't work.
No, the builder works just fine, but you don't have to.
It worked for me. Yeah. In the case, taking just the one scenario that I care most about, which is UBI8 based images where we're installing the dependencies using RPM, only extensions can install dependencies via RPMs. So if you disable the extensions with a builder that relies on that, then you'll have build packs that want to run subsequently that will find that their dependencies haven't been met, so the build will fail.
Yeah, I guess what I want to do is I want to make sure that we satisfy realistic use cases, right? Not just the easiest use case that we could think of. And if some of that means that we should iron out sort of this validation aspect of things, then I feel like we should. To not let the users, whether it be end users or platforms or whatever, sort of in a chaotic state where they can't fully, satisfy the end cases that are necessary.
Let me try to make the case one more time, because I feel like I in my view, I feel like there's no problem, but maybe I'm not seeing it, right? So you can think of, like, on the one side, you have a platform, let's say like KPAC, where the platform operator has sort of full control, right? You control the platform and you control the builder, right? So if you're going to provide, let your users use a builder that relies on extensions, right? And you enable extensions in your platform, you can ensure that the extensions that you provide don't allow your end users to select an arbitrary run image, right? So, like, the platform operator has within their control all the means necessary to make sure that it works, right? And then you kind of zoom over to the other end where there's, like, let's say PAC, right? Where the end user, they have control over their builder, right? But you're still sort of saying, like, use at your own risk, right? If you're going to provide a builder that has an extension that could select an arbitrary run image, we'll make sure that run image has the right mix-ins, like you're using this experimental feature, right?
Okay, so I think there's a difference, right? We're talking about experimental feature, where I guess maybe I'm thinking about how to move forward past the experimental feature. I guess ultimately I don't care about the experimental feature, right? Like, yeah, it's experimental at your own risk. What I care about, and I thought what we were talking about, is what are the next steps after that experimental phase, right? Like, what is the next quick follow-up? Is it, and again, it sounds like we want to hash out who should own the validation, and then whether that validation should be regarding stacks or targets.
So let's even consider the case where you have known run images defined in the builder. So, like, the extension can choose from one of the predefined run images, what would validation still look like from a platform basis? Because at the end, the run image validation would depend on the build packs that were selected. So let's say you have a build pack that requires, I don't know, a Python mixin. So it requires the Python interpreter to be on the run image. And then one of the run images has Python. And like the rest don't. There's like maybe a Scratch image or a Node image, whatever. And only when the Python build pack is selected, you want that mixin validation with the Python run image. I think, like, what are we saying, that if you use this feature, you just let go of mixin validation in its entirety, or do we still want to care about it and have the lifecycle validated somewhere?
Having the life cycle do the validation is like the easiest thing, right? Like I actually don't even know why. I think the reason the life cycle doesn't do it is because it's faster. If the platform does it, the platform doesn't even need to start a container in order to do it. I'm not opposed to doing it. I just think it's, it's more stuff to do, more time spent on things that we're going to throw away, a few months from now.
So I guess that's the part that I want to get at, right? Is throw away. So like, if that is the concern, right, throwing away, then we could talk about what if we move over and kind of coordinate it with the release of the stack removal.
I think an alternative option is, as a platform, you create a builder with extensions with this experimental API, you just implicitly opt into no mixin validation. That's something the platform agrees to. I think we have agreed as a project that mixin validation didn't serve the needs it was supposed to, and it was overtly strict. And that's why we got rid of it in the first place. Like, actually making that transition is a separate story, but like just like allowing users to use this base image change functionality, and by doing that, they just say we will let go of mixin validation because it's going to go away anyway in the future.
Okay.
So
Yeah, that makes sense for experimental.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep. So we can release this as experimental. If you create a builder with this experimental feature, you opt into the fact that there will be no mixin validation. And when we get to stack removal, we can figure out how to actually deal with this. And at that point, the experimental feature doesn't become stable. Does that would unlock the next lifecycle release? That would mean the platforms that want to use this feature but are agreeing to let go of mixin validation, which I don't know how many platforms actually care about or are actually providing correct mixins and then using that in build pack. So I think there's something to be said about that feature in the first place. But I think I would be fine with releasing this feature as experimental with the warning saying that if you use this, you use a builder with this, you just let go of mixin validation. It's not going to happen. And then we figure this whole thing out when we actually do stack removal. Does that work?
Can say quickly.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No, I was just saying I couldn't hear you.
Oh no. So I think what I heard is, this will be experimental, and then at some point we'll figure out stack removal, and then only then we'll stop calling it experimental, basically.
Yep.
I like it.
And it sounds like, at least in the initial sense, and we could revisit it, but it sounds like putting the validation of whatever it may be in the future could likely live in the life cycle.
Yeah, that's ultimately what we want. Like platforms could also do some checks, I think, but you want it in both places.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think I know we would want it when we create a builder to some extent, but for that reason, we could take it in as a library, right? So we would ask that it be consumable as a library, that logic, and then everybody's happy.
I think at some point we wouldn't even need the validation. The validation was there to prevent cases where you were using build packs that needed some dependencies, but you couldn't make those dependencies available in your base images. With extensions, rather than just validating, you can mutate your build or run images to conform to whatever your build pack needs. So I think the extensions are sort of like the solution to getting rid of mixins once and for all. Like, you don't need to validate for it anymore. The extensions look at the requirements that your build packs gave, and then they can modify the base images accordingly. So like, it would be up to the extensions to say like, oh, this build pack needs Go, I'll just install Go on it. Or and that way you no longer need mix-in validation. At least that's how I am looking at it.
Yeah, I think the fun comes in when you start considering rebasing, which is later.
Yep.
Everything up until that point is fine because it's the rebasing operation which required the mix-in validation in a way to know that what you're about to do makes sense. But we've already got some of the stuff in the Docker file RFC that says that basically certain things won't be rebasable unless you swear blind as your best promise as a developer that it will still work. So I think actually maybe that is a reflection of what we're talking about with mix-ins here, because if you're allowed to say in a Docker file that actually you are rebasable, then essentially you're making the statement that your mix-ins are compatible.
I think for rebasability, we had introduced this concept of image families or image family identifiers. I don't think we've actually mapped out how that would work. So let's say you switch, like during this whole extension stuff, you create, you switch to a Python-based run image, and you mark that as rebasable equals true. And you want to rebase it with a new version of that Python-based run image. You need to know which like family of images it comes from to rebase it.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. But I mean, yeah, the Docker file RFC at the moment just got the flag that says rebasable true or not. And if you set that, rebasing is allowed. And the implication of setting that is that obviously you're declaring that whatever you rebase it to or whatever state you're in is going to be something that meets the requirements of the application, which was what mixins was for. So it is an interesting way that all of this stuff is a lot more connected. But yeah.
If we still want to preserve a rebase with this experimental feature, then I think the only way to go about it is what Natalie said, with like having pre-canned run images in your builder config. So if you change the builder config with the new version of that image, then the platform knows how to rebase it. So like for platforms like Kpack that are declarative, and your builder config dictates when to trigger a rebase operation, you can update your builder config with a new version of the run image, and it can actually, like, lifecycle puts an appropriate metadata in the output image anyway to figure out which base image it used for the run image. So this way it will know that, okay, I changed from this to this, so all the applications that were on image A now need to be moved to image B.
Yeah, it's definitely beyond where we've got with the Dockerfile RFC at the moment. We don't get into declaring sets of images, but I suspect that's where the other crossover is that Natalie's getting at, which is the crossover between stacks and that. Because if anything, stacks was the definition that would have allowed the multiple base images or the multiple run images to be declared. So without them, I think that's where this whole conversation comes back together. And I think, yeah, you're right. We shouldn't try and visit this until after we've at least dealt with the capability of allowing other run images. And then as we figure out how to take that from experimental to full, we're going to have to tackle these problems as we go.
Is there anything we need to do to sort of notify the user that they're foregoing mix and validation for the experimental API? Is it like documentation we should update or a warning that the lifecycle or platform should?
Who's the user in this case? Like, is it the platform operator? Is it the build pack author? Is it the builder author, whatever? Is it the app developer?
That's a good point. Looking at it from pack perspective, if we're doing this on the create builder, obviously we could do it there. And then I guess it doesn't necessarily matter at build time, right? When you execute, because at that point you have no choice. You didn't have a choice to opt in.
So there's like kind of two. I was spending some time yesterday caring for this, but there's two concepts of like experimental that we introduced a long time ago and never implemented. The first is the concept of an experimental API, or an API that's not ready, subject to change. And then there's the concept of an experimental feature, which is basically like you have to set an environment variable. So you could, as a platform or as an app developer, you can provide, Pack would need to expose a flag, I think, to, whatever, turn on experimental features in the life cycle. And if you haven't set that variable, you will not, or will warn, or something will happen, right? I can get the RFC. There's two RFCs that deal with it. And I think we'll probably want both for Docker files, right? The first one, the experimental API is more of a protection for the lifecycle developer, right? That we will not have to maintain infinitely old versions of this, API that we're trying to get right here. And then the second one is a protection for the user that hey, use at your own risk, right? So I think we'll probably want both.
Okay, so what that means to me is that when you're using Pack and you're trying to use extensions, you're selecting an experimental, is it build Pack API? Is that true?
I think it's at the platform level. Here's the RFC.
Okay.
This is the RFC I wrote.
Yeah. I was reading it in great detail yesterday.
Sorry.
And then the builder should have an environment variable that you mentioned, right? Do you mind linking that in the document?
We spent several minutes now on this topic. I did want to bring up just sort of like the second half of the list of concerns, which was around putting stack removal stuff in the distribution API. I know this was particularly a concern of Emily's, and she's not here, but just wondering if anyone had thoughts about that kind of at a high level.
So, I mean, is there any specific feedback on a, sort of desired strategy, or is it just a concern and we should hash out what works best?
I think, and I haven't thought about this too deeply, but I feel like at first glance, it's sort of taking, two specs that are supposed to be disjoint, right? That's why they're not one spec, they're two, and really saying that the platform spec now has a hard dependency on the distribution spec, right? You can say like this platform spec requires distribution spec 0.3 or above, right? Or like, there's that coupling that's maybe not ideal. So just as an example, right, the distribution spec will say like your builder image must have a label indicating like IO build packs distribution name or something like that, right? And we're sort of, that's a requirement in the distribution spec, but the lifecycle might need to read that variable in order to provide some platform features, right? So as a platform operator, you have to make sure that your builder conforms to this other spec in order to get the features that you want. And I don't know if that's a problem or not.
Well, I think the reason why we moved it out was because we already were experiencing this issue within the spec itself, right? Trying to remember if there was anything concrete that I could bring up as an example. But I think the idea of separating is more or less sort of like artifact versus runtime, right? So like the distribution spec is the artifact, the thing that gets stored somewhere. And these are the things that, if you want to distribute sort of this artifact that's going to then be used by this thing that executes build packs, then that's the only thing that you should be looking at. Whereas the platform API, and even more so the build pack API, they define sort of this interface on the runtime, right? And I guess I see where effectively they're almost, or they are essentially the same thing. And so I'm trying to remember of certain cases where they could effectively be different or separated.
You could think of one of them as like a spec for stack authors, right? And the other one is a spec for platform implementers. But as a platform implementer, you'd like to have the right stack. So they
I guess the thing is, I don't know that I view the specs, per persona, and maybe that's just something that we should discuss. I view the specs more as sort of interfaces, right? As sort of the API idea goes. Like this is a contract for how these two things interact. It's not really tailored to a persona per se. So maybe we need to align on what it means, right? And I feel like we've had this conversation before, like what is a spec? And what do we want to put? Like, why isn't it, just one whole thing with multiple sections? But I mean, that's a very different, drastic view.
I don't have a strong opinion, just for the record. I want us to do something that everyone's happy with, but I don't, you know, I just think that this conversation has been looming in our minds for a while as something that, you know, we need to have, but we're not exactly sure what we want to get out of it. And in the meantime, we're just sort of delaying doing anything about it. So we probably need Emily here because she actually, I think, could more concretely state what exactly she's, you know, can foresee as being, you know, possible problems.
Right. I think that's what I'm looking forward to, right? I guess I'm wanting to hear essentially what the desired outcome is. And why what we have isn't it. For what it's worth, I really like the distribution spec, right? It's nice, clean, it's artifacts, it's all there. But yes, I see that from a runtime perspective, we need to solve how we either A, reference things or how we're organized.
Do we want to just put a pin in this particular topic until I think Emily will probably be back next week, it sounds like. At least from when I was texting her, she was recovering, but not quite there yet to be in meetings and stuff.
Would Jesse be able to join as well, or is he still occupied?
I mean, he's probably still occupied.
Okay.
I'm just a rebel, and now I'll go to CNB things.
Joe had commented, you know, somewhere that we shouldn't wait on Jesse.
I mean, I think if you want to hand him something async to read or preview, like that is acceptable, but I think it'll be hard to probably get him into a meeting.
Okay. I think that's the end of our agenda and the end of the meeting. Thank you all for joining. We'll see you next time.